evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Rondeli Foundation's event dedicated to discussion of new realities in the South Caucasus. As our audience, those who follow us, already knows, we had been hearing the viewpoints and assessments about the recent developments, about the renewal of conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and agreement, November 10th agreement from our colleagues and partners from Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have already planned the webinar series with the participation of participant speakers from Iran and Russia for the next week. But today we have an opportunity to hear the perspective from Turkey, from our today's distinguished speaker, Mr. Sinan Ülgen. Mr. Ülgen is a chairman of the Istanbul-based think tank, the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, EDAM, and a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Mr. Ülgen, thank you for being with us and finding time. The November 10th agreement has brought a new status to a new status quo in the South Caucasus. And many contemplate what has Russia gained out of this. Some argue that it has reached its goal to increase its presence in the South Caucasus by increasing its military presence, specifically under the label of peacekeepers, thus getting into Azerbaijan, on the territory of Azerbaijan for the first time since the demise of the Soviet Union. Some say that on the contrary, it's not a victory at all, but more a face saver for a regional hegemon watching for more than a month how its strategic partner, the only treaty ally in the region, has been attacked by a neighboring country with the support of Turkey. So whatever are the outcomes for Russia, one thing that was obvious during those developments is the increased role of Turkey. And definitely the influence of Turkey in the South Caucasus has elevated to a different level. And the growth of Ankara's presence in the region that was in the making for years now has become a reality. And I'm sure that our audience here in Tbilisi, in Georgia, will be interested to hear what is the discussion about all of this in Turkey, and also about your assessment of this agreement and the developments. Also, you are more than welcome to comment on anything you deem important about this issue. But before giving this virtual floor to you, Mr. Again, I would like to make one technical remark for the audience, those who are listening us and will be sending questions. Please, we'll be gathering them, but do that through the question and answer tool on the in the Zoom and not through the chat. This would make us for us easier to gather the questions and ask them in due course. And we are also on live on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and thank you, Mr. Ülgen, for agreeing to share your assessment. And floor is yours.
Dear Professor Metreveli, first of all, many thanks for your kind invitation, and also to the Rondeli Foundation. It's really a big pleasure for me to be with you and your guests today. I will try to do my best to give you the Turkish perspective as to what happened, and obviously draw some conclusions, again, from the Turkish perspective about the future impact. Let me start by underlining perhaps a few observations. Looking back over the past few years, the Turkish support to Azerbaijan really gathered pace in the last decade or so. And we have seen this relationship becoming more robust and more diversified over the years. There has been an economic component to that relationship, an energy component to that relationship, a political component to that relationship, and more recently, really, a security and defense component to that relationship. I think what we saw during this, 6-week campaign is how effective the Turkish collaboration, Turkish assistance that dates back to a number of years. It's not something that is totally new, but how effective it has been in upgrading the capacity of the Azerbaijan military in several ways. The first one, which is the more visible aspect of this, has really been the purchase by Azerbaijan of a number of important military, strategic military assets from Turkey, primarily the armed drones, but also electronic warfare systems. Secondly, and I think this is also very important because in many countries around the world, and I think the Gulf countries are a prime example of this, getting advanced military technology is not sufficient for success in the battlefield. And we see this, for instance, very clearly in Yemen, where some of the Gulf countries that are in possession of, very advanced military technology have been unable to score a major success. But in the case of Baku, they have, the operation, the campaign has been very successful because they were able to combine this strategic weapons that they've acquired from Turkey, but also partially from other countries, including Israel, with a general doctrine. So they've really been able to organize their battlefront tactics according to very modern, according to very modern recipes about how you combine these strategic assets with other platforms, how you prepare a doctrinal order of battle in view of these very different systems. So I think the Turkish assistance, as we can see, has not been on the side of the military procurement, but also on the side of military doctrine, which I would argue made the real difference. It has really overhauled the way that Azerbaijan military has been able to operate on the ground, combining these very different assets for a much superior effectiveness. And I think this made the second difference. Now, altogether, what the third factor that I want to underline is that the Turkish support to Azerbaijan, and this would be no secret to many of my friends in Tbilisi, has been traditionally very strong. The Turkish population, but also the Turkish government, views this relationship as somewhat of an emotional relationship. There are, kinship relations between the Turkish population and the Azerbaijan population. We speak almost the same language. So the Turkish government position, which has been quite clear from the beginning of the crisis, which was unmitigated political support to Baku, has received overall a large degree of support domestically as well. And when we compare to many other theaters of conflict where Turkey was involved, ranging from Syria to Libya, in some of these cases, the Turkish population was divided. For instance, the Turkish military engagement in Libya was divisive. It certainly was backed by the government, but the parliamentary opposition was not very keen on sending Turkish troops there, on voting for the type of resolution that would increase Turkey's military liability and engagement in Libya. In Azerbaijan, that certainly was not the case. The population was very much there was a bipartisan support. But obviously the Turkish, support to Azerbaijan was more indirect in nature, as I said. The fourth factor is that politically, the victory of Azerbaijan on the ground does indeed raise a new scenario for the Southern Caucasus, where you have a much stronger Turkish influence and footprint in the region. Firstly, obviously in Azerbaijan, the fact that Turkey supported Azerbaijan so strongly also created an atmosphere, a very pro-Turkish atmosphere in Baku. Some of that to the detriment of Russian influence in Azerbaijan. But all in all, so there has been that sort of shift in and around Baku. More importantly, what we have seen, as in the wake of this conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, is really a case study of how the world order in general has changed in the past 10 or 20 years. Because normally, this was a frozen conflict since the early 1990s when, the occupation took place. And since then, there was a multilateral effort led by the Minsk Group, co-chaired by Russia, France, and the UK, that tried to find a political settlement to the problem of Nagorno-Karabakh. But these efforts, as we know, despite some early momentum, had basically failed. There was no movement on the ground, and the parties were no closer to a settlement compared to 20 years ago. So, however, today, with Turkey's involvement and Azerbaijan's major military success on the ground, we see a different sort of change in the political balances in the region, where you have the emergence of a Russia-Turkey collaboration, which essentially started to replace the former diplomatic instrument of the Minsk Group. This is not something that is very, very new. We saw this also in Syria, where despite being, not being, seen at least as natural partners, and for good reason, Turkey is a NATO country. In many areas, it has a very different viewpoints compared to Russia. It certainly has not accepted, the annexation of Crimea. It has not accepted Turkey defends also very strongly the territorial integrity of Georgia. So in many areas, Turkey and Russia have very different outlooks on regional dynamics. But this is why I want to reference the world order. But at the same time, Moscow and Ankara have been able to cooperate in a number of areas that have become of mutual interest. We saw a very first blueprint of this Turkey-Russia cooperation in Syria, where Turkey, because of a lack of appetite from its traditional partners in the West, primarily the US, but also Europe, found that it needed to establish a cooperation with a party like Russia in order to stabilize the situation in Syria, because fundamentally Turkey was the country that was most affected by the security spillovers of the Syrian crisis. Today, there are almost 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and therefore Turkey had to intervene one way or another in order to prevent a much more acute scenario developing across its borders. So the Astana group, which is Turkey, Russia, and Iran, where Russia and Iran had obviously supported the Assad regime while Turkey was trying to oust that regime. Turkey had an agenda of regime change since the beginning of the crisis from 2011 till the Moscow Agreement of 2015. But because Turkey didn't get the support that it needed from its Western partners, even after the use of the chemical weapons in Syria by the Assad regime, there was a need to switch to a more realistic policy. And that realistic policy, in a way, dictated this Astana process, where Turkey, Russia, and Iran started to cooperate in order to stabilize Syria. Now we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh another facet of that Turkey-Russia cooperation. At the beginning, I must say, I was also a bit concerned that with a very strong backing of Turkey to Azerbaijan and the known proclivity for Russia to be more perhaps careful of the interest of Armenia, traditionally and historically, that Turkey and Russia could find themselves in a much more tense environment that could raise the stakes for the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. However, that was not the outcome. On the contrary, Turkey and Russia were able to cooperate and essentially were the lead countries, primarily Russia, but also with Turkish support, that ultimately culminated in the peace deal. So we see, therefore, another instance where the Turkey-Russia collaboration became quite instrumental. My final, perhaps, statement on how things are viewed from the Turkish perspective would be to state that this outcome is certainly viewed very positively in Turkey. At the end of the day, Azerbaijan was victorious. It was able to free most of its lands from the occupation of Armenian forces. However, there are two major areas that will continue to impact how what sort of scenario may unfold. Obviously, the first one is the fact that the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh still remains unsettled. The peace deal does not address that. Turkey wants to be part of the process of a political settlement. And there's obviously uncertainty about who's going to be in the lead, in the driver's seat for that political settlement, given the role of the Minsk group traditionally. That's the first aspect that I want to underline. And the second aspect, again, for a future scenario going forward, I think the Turkish government could also seize this opportunity to essentially improve its relationship with Armenia. Because as many of you may know, the border has been closed, I think back in '94, on account of the Armenian occupation of the Karabakh territory. Now that has come to an end, albeit forcefully. That would give room for a Turkish government to envision a more, a smart approach to engagement with Armenia when the time comes. Now, this is not going to happen overnight. It is still, I think, very raw, both in Turkey, in Armenia, and Azerbaijan, what happened in November. But nonetheless, going forward, given that the main reason why Turkey took this step of closing down its borders to Armenia has now disappeared, there might indeed be opportunity in the months to come for Turkey to create an environment that is more conducive to a normalization of its relationship with Armenia. Of course, that would also require, and we still don't know, what is going to be the political impact of this battle, this war, on the future of the Pashinyan government in Armenia. But if there is, either the Pashinyan government, if it stays in power, or possibly, a new government in Armenia, would also need to be interested in a rapprochement with Turkey. And then we can indeed talk about, the conditions becoming more mature for rapprochement. And I think when you look at the Southern Caucasus, the normalization of this relationship should certainly be welcomed. You are muted.
Thank you for this very interesting commentary and for explaining the perspective from Turkey and your assessment. Actually, you have touched upon some of the issues which I wanted myself to use the moderators, the advantage in monopoly, and ask myself, but you have already covered. I just wanted to reiterate about this the issue of maybe opening, the possibility of opening the borders this rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey. We all have observed back in 2009 that these steps were taken, and many watched with interest the Bursa football match, but then these efforts failed, and one of the reasons was exactly Azerbaijan's position. So it's not maybe only Armenia that should be ready for that. By the way, our respondents in this webinar series from Armenia have mentioned about this possibility that maybe they need to start to talk with Turkey and Azerbaijan in order to get out of this total dependency of Russia. But of course, they are not in majority right now. As you've mentioned, everything is still quite hot on both sides. But what do you think? Will Turkey and Armenia's position and willingness will be enough to push that process forward? I mean, Azerbaijan's position.
Well, I think that it is, today a bit premature to talk about, to judge whether this is possible or not. The only thing I can say, and I've said it, is that today there is a new window of opportunity to engage, diplomatically on that basis. However, there are a number of conditions that need to be fulfilled for the parties to really advance this agenda and essentially reach a point where the relationship can be normalized, unlike the failed efforts of 2009. And here I want to address two, conditions. One, also as discussed briefly, this cannot be taken, totally in a way that's totally disassociated from the political settlement talks about the future of Nagorno-Karabakh. I think whether we want it or whether we like it or not, we need to be realistic, and I think Turkey's diplomatic engagement with Armenia will also depend to some extent about whether Yerevan and Baku can advance on the talks regarding the political future of Nagorno-Karabakh. Given that this today remains an uncertain matter, it has not been addressed in the peace deal. That is obviously one big basket. And the second one is, is the historical legacy between Turkey and Armenia. That was one of the thorny issues even back in 2009. There are a number of commitments that Turkey wants from the Armenian government. Primarily, a commitment that this very tragic period of history, 1915, should be reviewed by a group of historians, and it should not be politicized. That the Armenian government should not seek the support of foreign parliaments to try to pressure Turkey. That yields, no real benefits. That is going to be the second part. And of course, the third part, which I think also has to be said, is whether, even if it's a Pashinyan government, a Pashinyan government would be, very weakened with this outcome. If it's not a Pashinyan government that negotiates with Turkey, the new Armenian government that will be there might end up being, more pro-Russian than the current Armenian government. And therefore, it will be important also to convince, the Russian policymakers that a Turkey-Armenia diplomatic normalization would also be good for Russia. And that is, easier said than done, because, in the past, the Russian position in many cases has been to continue to, or at least try to, not to be very, perhaps, supportive of a Turkey-Armenia normalization, because the fact that there is a conflict there might help Moscow to acquire more influence, or to keep its influence in Yerevan. So I think those are the three different elements that I would take into consideration to really be able to estimate whether this window of opportunity, which I think is real, will actually yield a different outcome than 2009.
Thank you, Mr. Ülgen. And we are getting quite a bit of questions and quite interesting. So I would like to start from them. It's quite hard to be talking, listening, and then reading the questions. But we are, I guess, all getting used to this multiple task work. There is a question from Gia Nodia. Thank you, Mr. Nodia, for being with us. And it's a question about Russian-Turkish cooperation that you've talked about on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. However, is there no element of competition as well? Is Turkey happy about all aspects of the peace agreement where Russia is a central player, but Turkey is not mentioned? There are debates about Turkey's role in the peacekeeping operation, maybe in some kind of a monitoring role. How do you envision Turkey's role, if any, in the new realities created on the ground? And I would like also to add on that, because that was the question which also kind of was floating around. What will be the role of Turkey status, more correctly to specify status of engagement of Azerbaijan, Turkey in Azerbaijan. And of course, this monitoring, all the debate regarding this role of a monitor's function is interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we are not yet, privy to all the details of the discussions that been held between the authorities, between Ankara, Moscow, Ankara, Baku. But from what we understand, the Turkish role in terms of monitoring peace is going to be much more limited than Russia's role. Russia has, the much more major status. It is the one that has sent, peacekeepers, which are, actually possibly even more than peacekeepers, given how, heavy weapons they have carried to the Lachin corridor. But nonetheless, Russia is the major country that is sending the peacekeepers to Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey's role is different. It's not the same as Russia. However, Turkey will cooperate with Azerbaijan, in setting up a unit which will not be in Karabakh, unlike the Russian presence. So there won't be Turkish troops in Karabakh monitoring the peace mission. But this will be in the territory of Azerbaijan, and there there will be a Turkish military presence. Yesterday, the Turkish Parliament adopted a bill to send troops there for this particular mission, which will be monitoring the peace deal out of the territory of Azerbaijan. So in that sense, I agree with the general, framing of the question. This is not, ideal from the Turkish perspective. I assume the Turkish government would, wanted to have a more visible role in the peacekeeping operations. But at least this is nonetheless an area where Turkey has an engagement and an involvement. And we shall see in due time how this particular mission, which will be about monitoring, and the Russian presence in Karabakh, which will be about peacekeeping with boots on the ground, will actually work together, or will there be, tension and friction, going forward between these two missions? That's, I think, is a critical question.
Thank you. And there is another question also from Gianodia, that you mentioned that Turkey is a member of NATO, but did not Turkey's role in the last war, seen as encouragement of Azerbaijan's war effort, another factor for alienation between Turkey and other NATO members?
I think, Turkey's very firm support to Azerbaijan came as a result of the failure of international diplomacy. This is something that, if I were to speak to those in the West and our NATO allies that criticize Turkey's position, this is what I would tell them as a first argument. Had international diplomacy succeeded in settling this frozen conflict, which had been there since the early 1990s, there would not have been a need for this type of military operation. Secondly, and I think Turkey is on very strong legal ground. We are talking about a territory that's been unlawfully occupied by Armenia, and the enforcement of the 4 different UN Security Council resolutions, which income on the Security Council, has been futile. So in that sense, I think Turkey's support to Azerbaijan is not something that can be very easily criticized. It has led to a situation that ultimately helps to redress international law. This is what the UN Security Council had agreed on, but it did not have the political willingness to enforce what it had agreed on. And I think many observers in the region, and I'm sure this is the same in Tbilisi, were aware that at some point, and we've seen many signals in the past, that if diplomacy fails to such extent, then with the changing dynamics on the ground, with the changing balance of forces, with the size of the 2 economies, with defense spending, Azerbaijan was going to initiate an action to regain control over its territories. So in many ways, therefore, and given that, even though it certainly has produced, like all wars, a humanitarian tragedy, nonetheless, when you look at the outcome, I don't think that from the pure point of, NATO alliance, there is really a lot of room to criticize Turkey on its support to Azerbaijan.
Thank you. And here is the quite short and direct question about what options are for Karabakh status that could be on the table. So options for the Karabakh status.
Yeah, I think the options for Karabakh status are no different than what all the parties have been discussing over the past few years. It's just that today the political constellation has greatly changed, and I think now that as the victorious side, the popularity of Aliyev in Baku is at an all-time high. So I think if Azerbaijan is willing, it's now become easier to find a solution to Nagorno-Karabakh in a way that would be acceptable to both sides. I think the problem in the past was that Azerbaijan never really fully believed in the commitment of Armenia to pull back from the occupied territories. With this war, that to a large extent has been solved, although not totally. Still part of the territory is under occupation. But more importantly, it's really about domestic politics. And coming out of a victorious era, I think it's now easier for leadership in Baku to also convince its domestic population that to solve this problem, there needs to be a degree of, of autonomy, a degree for special consideration of these territories. And it's become, for a strong leader, it's become easier for a strong leader now in Baku to have that deal accepted without much resistance. So I think in that sense, we are now closer to a settlement, a political settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh than we have ever been since 1992.
Okay, before the questions are coming, I would have such a question regarding the transportation corridors. That one of the provisions of the agreement is the transportation corridor between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper, and guaranteed by Russian forces. And how do you think, what are the expectations in Ankara, and also from economic perspective as well, regarding this corridor? Can it become the main artery connecting Turkey with the rest of the Turkic world in the Central Asia, on the background of Russian border and customs services controlling of it?
I don't want to, really overplay the importance of this corridor. I think it's wrong to think that just because there is this corridor now between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan, suddenly Turkey will find an outlet to Central Asia, because it would essentially forget the role that Georgia has played also in helping Turkish trade. I think, in the past years when, this road had been blocked, this is not a new road. It existed in the past. It just got blocked, after 1994. Georgia was quite instrumental in collaborating with Turkey. So I think the opening of this road is certainly a positive development, and it is seen as such. Just when you look at the map now, the fact that Nakhchivan is not anymore a totally enclave geography is also good for Azerbaijan. But ultimately, when you look at it from the Turkish perspective, you don't want a situation where the Russian influence will be such that if things turn sour between Turkey and Russia, which is in this geography always possible, given that this borders or this crossing this will be under the control of the Russian customs officials, Turkey does not want to put all these cards on this corridor. So I think the relationship with Georgia, despite the fact that this corridor may be opened, the relationship with Georgia remains vital for Turkey's political economic interest.
Thank you for this. And here is the question from Jeren coming. In July, Armenia attacked Tavrus area where international pipelines are, and they adopted a language referring to Serbs treaty. Do you think Armenia will adopt a conciliatory politics or continue that pre-war line?
Well, I think what we see in Armenia, and I'm been trying to follow both the internal politics but also the position of the diaspora. There certainly is, a very, severe disillusionment in the Armenian diaspora about the outcome of this war. Now, when Pashinyan got elected, there was a lot of speculation that he would be more amenable to having a policy that would be more conducive also for a diplomatic normalization with Turkey. But ultimately, the pressure of the diaspora prevailed, so that despite some warm statements at the beginning of his stint in power, the Pashinyan government was not able to move beyond these very restrained vision of how they see their role in the region. Now, after the war, a lot will depend on whether Pashinyan can re-establish his credibility at home, firstly, and in a way, and ultimately understand that his country's future, but also his political future, may indeed depend on normalizing relations with Turkey. Because when you look at the state of the Armenian economy, and that certainly has been the case for the past few years, it's not something new. The fact that there's now such a big divide between the economic dynamics in Azerbaijan and the economic dynamics in Georgia and the economic dynamics in Armenia has a lot to do with the fact that the Armenian economy cannot trade normally with its largest neighbor, which is Turkey. So I think for a leader that's interested in the economic being of its own population, he or she needs to distance himself from the pressures of the diaspora and perhaps somewhat from the pressures of Moscow to normalize the relationship with Turkey. So whether Pashinyan is able to do that under these circumstances, or whether a new government, that would come in the wake of the Pashinyan government is able to do that, I think that is indispensable if Armenia wants to have, rising living standards, a better functioning economy. And I think also from the perspective of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, having Armenia as part of this, space of free trade in the Southern Caucasus would be good for all countries, but primarily for Armenia. And this is something that I want to underline.
Thank you. And here are two kind of related questions regarding, again, the future of Karabakh. One question states that, can Turkey be interested in convincing Azerbaijan government to accept Nagorno-Karabakh independence in today's reduced territorial limits, which would finish the confrontation between Azerbaijan and Turkey? And another question also related to Karabakh future is, how do you think can Azerbaijan return back Karabakh after the deployment of Russian peacekeepers there?
If I understand the first question correctly, my answer will be a firm no. There is absolutely no interest in Turkey that I've heard of in the direction of trying to convince the government in Baku to recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh. That is not a scenario that is at all contemplated. On the contrary, I mean, and we discussed this briefly, the only scenario that seems feasible to me is one where, to talk about the constitutional status of Nagorno-Karabakh, which certainly would not be independence, but what sort of special status can be envisioned, can be contemplated, and can end up being politically acceptable and sellable, really. That is the core of the problem of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, not independence. That's not an area where Turkey has an interest, and certainly would not get involved. Now, in terms of the return of the refugees, we have certainly, that's been one of the major now benefits and expectations, that a large part of these people who had to flee from their territory would not be able to come back. We're still very early in the process, but and this is perhaps one of the shortcomings of this peace deal, in the sense that even though the principle is accepted, there aren't any detailed conditions about its modalities. So, there is, there has been no discussion about, the reconstruction that needs to take place in this territory that would make it, more hospitable for the return of the refugees. And there are also no time frames that would allow this to happen in a way that is more transparent and in a way that will be more easily monitored. So I think what we are likely to see, therefore, is definitely some of these people will return. But nonetheless, at the same time, I think in this phase of, in this post-conflict phase, there would need to be some international attention to those modalities. Now, whether Russia and Turkey will want to take the lead on that, or whether there will be more countries involved, and we've heard definitely calls from France to become much more active on this as a co-chair of the Minsk group. But that certainly is an area, along with the fact of that the future of Nagorno-Karabakh has not been addressed in this peace deal. Also, many of the modalities that have to be ironed out in terms of the return of the refugees have not been fully clarified in the peace deal, and that's perhaps one of the shortcomings that need to be mentioned.
Thank you for this, Mr. Ülgen. But the second question was whether related to Russian peacekeepers, and whether on the background of Russian peacekeepers being in Karabakh, whether it can be returned back to Azerbaijan. How possible, how feasible you see that in face of Russian peacekeepers being there? So how that would make problematic more this?
Well, I mean, the fact that the Russian peacekeepers there, is going to be a disincentive. But that in itself is not going to be a categorical barrier to the return of the refugees. This is because these modalities have not been enshrined in the peace deal. I think what we are likely to see is, in a way, a trial and error period where we are going to see, people who at an early stage want to go back to their ancestral lands. And to the extent that they encounter problems, this is going to be an issue, in the months to come. And this is perhaps, again, this is because the modalities have not been set. So we don't know, for instance, on when, if and when there's a problem, who is going to be responsible to address that problem at a time when you indeed have Russian boots on the ground. What is going to be the role of of the government of Baku? What is going to be the role of Yerevan? What is going to be the role of Turkey as a country that has will have any engagement on monitoring the peace deal? So all of these issues have been left totally unaddressed, and I think this is why I think the fact of the return of the refugees is going to be one of the major uncertainties going forward.
Thank you. And I have a question regarding this peace process itself. You've mentioned in the opening remarks that Turkey and Russia have cooperated on a number of occasions quite well, despite divergent interests in general in many areas. And we have seen those cases, how the West was sidelined and two states have achieved the goal in this specific directions. But now we observe the same trend in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. So where is the West in all of this? And whether this becomes kind of solving regional conflicts becomes the role and function of the regional powers? Because we've just heard a couple of days ago the Turkish foreign minister saying that there are similar type of conflicts in the region, referring to Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova. So my question is how that peace process will go, whether there is a space for the West or engagement of regional powers becomes a trend. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. And I think as analysts, we're also trying to understand what this impact of the changes in the global order means for our region. A few words telegraphically, perhaps. I think the fact that countries like Turkey particularly has an increased role in the region also has to do with the fact that we have witnessed a transformation in the US foreign policy. And this is a generational transformation. It's not about Trump. It's not going to be about Biden. We saw it even in the Obama years, where you have, the American interest, the American population that has become more disengaged from foreign policy, where there's been a push domestically to return the United States to spend its political capital, its resources at home. So this type of more, assertive U.S. presence abroad is certainly is changing, and we do see this retrenchment, this proclivity for retrenchment in the United States. This coupled with the fact that the strategic focus of the United States is shifting to Asia. For Trump, that was the case, and it will certainly be the case with Biden as well. The United States now sees China as its main strategic rival. And therefore, this shift that, in the Obama years, was much criticized. You will all remember this, terminology of pivot to Asia is indeed happening. Now that means that the U.S. diplomatic engagement as well in the region will be minimized. I don't mean to say that it will be terminated, but it will be minimized. And in its place, the hope, at least for many of the transatlanticists, were that the European Union would develop as a more effective foreign policy actor and could step in and espouse the role of being a more influential, political actor in the region, whether it's in conflict settlement or in the management of conflicts. But that has not been the case. What we've seen in Europe as well, especially after the Amsterdam Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, has been the almost a division of the foreign policy, and instead of foreign policy becoming more communitarized, more held under the auspices of the EU institutions, we have seen more foreign policy moving in the direction of national capitals. So France is more interested in having its own foreign policy rather than transposing it under the EU flag. The same can be said for Germany. So, and as a result, the EU did not come about as the type of actor that could actually replace the United States as an influential diplomatic actor in the region. That is why, neither in Syria nor in Karabakh, we have seen effective, European presence. And I think that certainly has been a rude awakening for many of the European countries. That may also be why Turkey has been criticized, because it was a very active actor while Europe was not. But nonetheless, I think here there is a lot of self-criticism from the European side. Europe had ample time to develop itself as a more effective foreign policy actor. And the fact that it has not now is, we are seeing the consequences of that in many of these regional conflicts. This is definitely a trend that has now reached a critical threshold. I don't think that the US will, at least in the foreseeable future, will shift to a position where it focuses its strategic interest on Europe, on Europe's neighborhood. That I think has ended for our generation. the shift has happened and it will continue in the direction of east of Asia. And that has consequences for all the countries involved, as long as the EU it fails to develop as a foreign policy actor that can act as the main pacifier or peace builder in this region.
Thank you, Mr. Ülgen. And now I think I have time for the very last question. And though we are still talking virtually, I'm in Georgia, so I cannot finish this conversation without asking the question about the Georgia. So the new reality, Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan, you know, Turkish increased presence, you know, all these geopolitical changes that you have been talking about. So how all of this would affect Georgia's security environment, and what is the role of Georgia? Where is Georgia in this Turkish-Russian relations in the South Caucasus?
Yeah, I think from a Georgia's perspective, and here I want to be very humble, I cannot, you know, claim to know Georgia's, you know, situation and national security concerns in any way, you know, better than you or the participants on this call. But viewed from the outside, I think Georgia would have an interest in having a more balanced power relationship in the Caucasus, in the Southern Caucasus, between Turkey and Russia. Turkey is a NATO country. Its proclivity is, you know, to side with the West. As discussed here in this call, the fact that Turkey is partner with Russia does not mean that Turkey is a strategic partner of Russia. Far from it. You know, we see in many theaters around the region, from Crimea to Georgia to Ukraine, how Turkey and Russia view things differently. So ultimately, I think the fact that Turkey now has a more visible influence and presence in the region as a NATO country would also be to the benefit of Georgia, compared to a scenario where, you know, Turkey has no visibility and therefore the overriding influential power remains Moscow. That, I think, would have been a more adverse outcome for Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Ülgen, for your excellent comments and insight. I'm sure Georgian audience, as well as international community, part of our discussion, have enjoyed it a lot. And thank you for your time. Also, I would like to thank everyone who participated and posed excellent questions, and hope to have you here at GFSIS at some point.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the work that you do. And I very much hope that, you know, once the pandemic is over, I will have an opportunity to visit Georgia.
Thank you. I'm sure too. Bye.
Thank you very much for hosting me.